Hi, welcome to this question. This question is for Leetcode 56. The question is called merged intervals. It falls under the umbrella of a type of questions involving intervals. It's just something that you really have to figure out how it works. And so we're going to first take a look at some examples, and then based on those examples, we're going to take a quick look at the code, and then a little bit of a run through of the theory of how the code works, and then maybe a little bit of the code again at the end. So let's take a look. Now, the first example we're going to take a look at, I suppose it's good to understand what you're given. So the given input in this type of question is that you're given an array, and this array contains arrays. So inside of these arrays that are given, they actually represent intervals. So if you see 3, 5, and 0, 3, they're actually represented over here on the left side. And I'll draw an arrow. So that's the first one. And that's the other one. I actually have them backwards, but you get the idea. I think what's important to know is what do you want to do with that? So what you want to do with that is that you want to see these intervals overlap if they're connected somehow. And you see visually that right here they're connected at this point for 3. And if you connect both of these together, you end up with this. And it becomes an interval from 0 to 5. Now, given the original input up here, the only way to really make sense of it is if the input arrays are sorted. And when we say sorted, we mean that we want it sorted based on the initial element, the first element's value of each of these arrays. And then the kind of result that you want to return is, after you merge all the overlapping intervals, how many arrays are left. In this particular example, you're only going to have 1, 0, 5. So let's take a look at another example really fast. In the second example, we're given 3 arrays as part of the input, 0, 2, 2, 4, and 5, 8. Luckily here, they're already sorted because 0 is smaller than 2, 2 is smaller than 5. So we don't need a sorting step here. What you want to do is you want to take a look at each of these intervals and kind of decide what it might look like at the end. And I think we know that 0, 2, and 2, 4 will get merged. So that's your first one, right? That will be 0 to 4. And then the second interval, it's not going to change. That interval is just going to be from 5 to 8. And that remains. And so your final answer for this particular example, and you see here, we have this circled. Whereas in the last example, you only have 1 item in the array, now we have 2. So we've seen an example of where you have to sort the input and an example where you do not have to sort. Let's take a look at one final example before we get into it. So in this final example, you also do not need to sort because you see that the initial element in each of these arrays, they are in ascending order. And you can see as we marked them out here, the first one 0, 2, 2, 5, and 5, 10. So what's interesting about this particular answer is that you see up here, it only has 1 element in the answer, and that answer is 0 to 10, because there's an overlap here at 2, and there's another overlap here at 5. So I think naturally when you're thinking about you have an array of items, will be like, we'll just call them A, B, C instead of an actual array. You take steps or iterations to compare A to B, right? The thing is, if you merge A and B together, so it's some combination of A, B, then you compare A, B to C. And you, at the end, in this case, it ends up being A, B, C. So that should give you a little bit of intuition that whatever you start with here in A might continually merge in more items here and here, maybe all the way to the end of the input array. So you have to think that you always need to realize what is at the beginning and perhaps move through the rest of the array to realize if you need more. So that's something we're going to take a look at really quickly. First, we're going to take a look at the code because it'll help us understand that when we look at the code, how we do these comparisons. So the way that we do this comparison is that first, on this first line, if we don't have anything, then it's going to be something where you're going to just return right away. So you don't have to worry about that. And then here in the second part, we talked about sorting in case the array is not in order. And I just want to mention this code is in JavaScript because I think this is some of the easiest code to read and to get into, and happens to be in the language that I understand the best for now. And so when we talk about comparing, for example, an item to its neighbor or to its adjacent, you want to say it could be current versus next, right? But actually, what makes sense to think about in this case is that you want previous versus current. The reason is what we talked about earlier is when you have an input array of maybe A, B, and C, they could all get merged in to the point where you really just want to make sure you always have the reference to this particular element, the very first element. So that's what we do here. We make a reference to the very first element. And so it's very possible that this particular first array never changes. But because we're using it by reference, we can actually change the ending or the second element. So see, the result contains this array. Let's just call it A and B, right? That's your result. The thing is, A is always going to stay the same, but B can constantly change. As we saw in the example where last time you started at 0, 2, and you went to 0, 10. So this is your for loop right here. And even though here we start at 0, you can technically start I at 1. And so you go through it, and if you start at 0, your current and previous will be equal. But if you start at 1, you don't have that duplicate comparison. And so the main comparison is that you want to see the second element of previous versus the first element of current. And you see that that's the main comparison. And if you have that condition met, then you have to see if you change the tail or the second element. And that's why I use math max. And this will make a lot more sense once we start looking at the code. And the reason you don't push into the result right away is because after you merge 1 and 2, maybe you want to merge a third one as well. And when there's no reason to merge, then you push onto the result. And then you change the reference of what previous should be. And so that's the code. And let's take a look at a walkthrough of this theory, because walking through it, I believe, is super important. So, oops. Now suppose we have an example where we're given 0, 2, and 2, 4 illustrated here and here. Now, what you want to do is you want to be able to set a previous here and then run through the loop all the way to the end, which in this case, is just 2 items. So that's pretty easy. And when you do that, you'll see that the answer is going to be 0, 4. Now, how do we get to that answer? It's very important. Let's take a look. We're going to compare. And what we talked about earlier was you compare beginning, end, or head and tail, whatever is easier for you to understand. So here's the current, and here it's the neighbor, right? But we just said maybe you might want to call this previous, or you want to call this current. It's whatever you want, really. It doesn't really matter, because the main thing is that you need to keep that kind of comparison clear in your mind. So which part of current and neighbor are we going to compare? Well, we're going to compare current end right here with the neighbor's beginning right here, right? So you see we're comparing 2 and 2. And because current's end is equal or greater, we know we're going to merge. Now, if we merge, what does that really look like? Because we saw earlier that with a math.max, you have to do something. So let's take a look. Because now you know that you're doing a merge, you have to compare the ends, or the tails. And so you see that 4 is greater, so we're going to take 4, and then you end up getting 0, 4 right here. And so that was the answer we had up top, 0, 4. If we take a look at the code really fast, we'll see that that's basically what we were trying to do this whole time. So we see again that, we were comparing, I guess, previous and current, which was here on this line. And when you have that, you're basically able to say, oh, okay, if I need to make that comparison, then I have to check the tail, or the second element, or the end element. And that's how I merge the items together. Okay, and so once again, that was Leetcode 56, merge intervals, and it follows, the technique of merging, technique of intervals. So you just have to know there's merging them, and the next video will be about inserting intervals. Thank you very much.